Bienvenidos, my darlings, and you know who you are. You look marvelous, absolutely marvelous. Now, that'll be lost on most of you who are in your 20s and 30s, but there was a sketch by Billy Crystal on Saturday Night Live called Fernando's Hideaway. And he would say to people, "You look marvelous. You look marvelous." And it was a catchphrase for a long time. As you can tell, that I got caught up in it as well. Hello, this is the Anxiety RX podcast. I am your host, Dr. Russell Kennedy, and you look marvelous today. Today, I am going to talk about addiction and anxiety and how it goes together. I was reading some studies, and the studies say somewhere between 30 and 50% of people with anxiety also suffer from addiction. I disagree with this. I think it is 100%. There's 100% of people with anxiety have some kind of addiction. Because the anxiety, the alarm, you can't deal with that on your own. It's just too painful, and it's too reminiscent of childhood wounding, childhood pain, that kind of thing. So we have to find some way of dealing with it. Now, in men, a lot of men deal with it with addiction, with alcohol specifically, and other prescription and non-prescription drugs. Women are less likely to be addicted to alcohol, although it's still a major problem, and much more likely to be addicted to prescription drugs. So addiction and anxiety, they go hand in hand. I don't know this thing where it says 30% of people with addictions have anxiety. I think it's 100% of people with addictions have anxiety. Maybe they don't know it, but that's what they're using their addiction to heal themselves, or to at least feel better. And that's the thing about addiction, is that there's many definitions of addiction. My definition is doing something that feels good in the short term but causes long-term problems. Very simple definition. And it seems to encapsulate a lot of what addiction does, because I think what addiction does at its core is it makes us feel good. It makes us feel good in a place and a way that we don't allow ourselves to feel good. A lot of people with anxiety have these blocks to love. And I talk about this in the book, in the first book, and the second book that's coming out in September, that really anxiety is just not allowing love. And if you don't allow love, basically your life fills up with fear. There's only love and fear, and it's kind of like a closed box. And if you don't allow love in, if you don't allow love for yourself or love for others or connection, eventually your box gets filled up with fear. And the more fear gets filled in your box, the more you look at the world as a fearful, scary, victim-based place. And one of the things that addiction does is it makes us feel more connected to ourselves. If you take, say, an opiate, if you take OxyContin, you will have this warm feeling of connection that probably you didn't have when you were a child. If you drink for the first little while, the first half an hour, 45 minutes, it affects your GABA receptors in your brain, and GABA is the neurotransmitter that's involved in inhibition and slowing you down and feeling relaxed. So that's why when you have a drink, initially, you have this sort of wave of relaxation, this peace. But the problem is that it sticks on the GABA receptors, your sort of inhibitory relaxation receptors, and it kind of, to use a scientific term, gums them up. So people need to take more alcohol. You need to drink more alcohol to kind of stay ahead of that anxious wave that you got a hold of, you got ahead of, and when you first took the drink. That's why I think alcohol is so addictive. And that's why people have to keep drinking to try and chase that level of relaxation that they had in the first place. But they can't, excuse me, because their GABA receptors are all gummed up now. So when your GABA receptors get clogged with alcohol, and this isn't technically exactly what happens, but it's the way I describe it to my patients, is that what alcohol does initially is it gives you this feeling of relaxation, and it can be quite significant. You know, if you look at Asian populations or indigenous populations, they don't have a lot of this enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. So alcohol hits their brain full force. So you get that full, intense relaxation effect from alcohol, stronger than you would in, say, Caucasian populations. And this is one of the reasons I think why alcohol is so addictive in those populations, especially the indigenous populations, is that it does provide this sense of calm, of peace, of connection initially. And then this agitation phase comes up. This is why when people drink alcohol to get to sleep, it will put them to sleep, but 90 to 120 minutes later, it wakes them back up because the neurotransmitters are now starting to change in direction into more glutamate, which is the opposite of GABA. So glutamate is the excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA is the inhibitory neurotransmitter. And I think a lot of people with anxiety have this excess of glutamate transmission. So what addiction does is it calms down that glutamate by activating GABA and other things too. I mean, opiate receptors are in there too, endorphins and enkephalins, runner's high, same kind of thing. It kind of provides this sense of relaxation through the body, but it doesn't last. So that's our definition of addiction, is that it makes you feel good initially, but it doesn't last. And in fact, when it gums up the receptors, you can't feel calm. And in fact, that's why there's an agitation. That's why when people are hungover, there's an agitation phase that often increases their anxiety. So what do? You just woke up. Why don't you have a beer? It's one of those things that it does work. These chemicals do work initially, but they cause long-term problems with the GABA, glutamate combination together. And really what causes addiction is this sense of longing, this sense of ache, this sense of disconnection, mostly from yourself. So if you grew up with a parent who was abusive or abandoning or neglectful or made you grow up too soon, take on responsibilities too soon, my little acronym for alarms, abuse, loss, abandonment, rejection, maturing too early, and shame. Shame is a powerful predictor of addiction because we don't address shame. It just sits in us. It's been said that, you don't have shame, shame has you, which I think is true as opposed to guilt. Guilt is something you can say, I've done something wrong, I'll do something about it. Shame is like, I ain't even going to deal with that. I'm not going to even open that door to that. And sometimes the pain from shame is so insidious and such a powerful energizer, a background alarm, that we wind up getting into addictions to kind of avoid that feeling. So, shopping, porn, sex, love, alcohol, drugs, prescription and non-prescription, marijuana, yoga can be an addiction. Exercise can be an addiction because it does help us deal with that feeling of separation within ourselves. When you get traumatized as a kid, there is a part of you that feels that you're responsible. There's this saying that says when you abuse, neglect, or abandon a child, the child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves. And that's true. There's a place in our brains called the posterior cingulate cortex, which may be playing a role in our own self-critic. Because when we use psychedelics or some addictive medications, that posterior cingulate cortex gets kind of paralyzed. So that constant negative self-chatter is gone when we use some of these addictive compounds and things like dissociatives. When we use psychedelics, that posterior cingulate cortex gets paralyzed. So we get a little break from that internal chatter, negative chatter from these compounds. Some of them, not all of them. So on some level, I don't see people with anxiety who don't have some kind of addiction that I just talked about. Shopping, porn, sex, love, alcohol, drugs, prescription, non-prescription, marijuana, yoga, exercise, and many, many more. Many, many more. Because we're self-medicating. We don't like this feeling. We hate this feeling. So we're not going to seek help from it. Women are much more likely to go to therapy and seek help from it. Men are much less likely to seek therapy, to seek help, and turn more towards addiction. Addiction happens in both sexes, absolutely. But in males, alcohol addiction is a prime candidate for the man to see that the alcohol is helping with their anxiety. But again, gums up your GABA receptors and you wind up getting more anxious the next day. So you have to keep drinking. And that's where alcoholism really gets a hold of you and you can't get out of it because the alcohol does tend to work. So initially, the anxiety creates the addiction. And then the addiction creates its own sense of shame, which creates anxiety, which creates more addiction. So you get anxiety, creating addiction, creating shame, creating more anxiety, creating more addiction, creating more shame. And it's just this loop that is really hard to get out of. And it starts typically in childhood. We have people that have a predisposition to anxiety, for sure. There's a predisposition to alcoholism. There may be a genetic component to anxiety. There may be a genetic component to addiction. There probably is. But usually there is some sort of trauma that wasn't dealt with. And typically it's in childhood. So when we find something that actually treats this alarm in our system, we ride it till the wheels fall off. And then 20s, 30s, your life is being impacted by your addiction. Your relationships certainly are being impacted by your addictions. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that you're not happy, you're not connected to yourself or others. And you just turn towards what helped you in the first place, or what you perceive helped you in the first place, which is the addiction. So that's why addictions tend to get more intense over the course of time. And we tend to use more of the substance. There's tolerance. We get tolerance in our system. That's why people get these tremendous amounts of cocaine use because they've built up a tolerance to it. Or opiates, OxyContin. You need more and more and more of the drug to create the same sense of connection within yourself, because I think that's what addiction does. Addiction allows us to feel the connection to ourselves that we normally won't, because our own judgments look at our own selves as shameful or disgusting or horrible. So when you look at yourself with that negative view, it's very powerful. And then when you take these compounds, all of a sudden you feel kind of connected to yourself, kind of warm towards yourself. You feel this sense that, oh, maybe this isn't so bad, while the drug or the addiction is happening. But then it always comes back, and you're always left with yourself. And you're always left with your self-talk and that posterior cingulate, maybe, that tells you that you're not a good person. Or you should be ashamed of yourself for being an alcoholic, being a cokehead, being whatever it is that you share with yourself, whatever you tell yourself that is separating, that keeps you locked in this feeling of not being able to connect with yourself. And I think on some level, what addictions do is they allow us to connect with ourselves in a way that we won't allow to be connected when we're sober. Let me say more about that. So in the cold light of day, we have all these negative feelings about ourselves. We won't let ourselves experience love because love was too vulnerable. For me, as an example, experiencing love from my father was very vulnerable because he was schizophrenic and bipolar. So I would love him. He would love me back. And there'd be this real strong connection there. And then he would go schizophrenic or psychotic or bipolar. And I would lose him. So in my mind, my little child subconscious mind, there was, well, it's not safe to love because it's just going to get taken away from you. So love is dangerous. Vulnerability is dangerous. And this is true with men as well. Men do not like feeling vulnerable. I don't think women like feeling vulnerable either, but it's just, for men, we're trained since we were children to not be vulnerable, to be lone wolves, to be tough, to be the fearful independent, or fearless independent, I should say. Fearful. And that's hard to keep up with. And it's very hard to maintain a relationship as a lone wolf. it's very difficult to maintain a relationship with yourself. If you are separated from yourself, which most people are in this society anyway, you are going to fill up with fear over the course of time. And addictions are one of those ways that allow us to keep going when we don't love ourselves. And I don't mean to make it say, oh, you have to love yourself. It's so important to put on lavender and rub candlesticks all over your body and just show yourself that you love. Like, men won't do that. They just don't. So how can we, as men and women, be more connected to ourselves? Really, that's what it comes down to. That's what the first book is about. That's what the second book is about, coming out in September. It's really about, we all have this ability to love ourselves. But because of our environment, when we were young, when we were children, we start blocking that love. I see it kind of as doorstops. You know, those wedge doorstops, triangular doorstops? They're like these wedge doorstops that were in me that stopped me from loving myself. And I think what, on some level, therapy does, somatic therapy does, sharing with other people, being connected to yourself, being connected to the group, starts pulling out those doorstops and allows you to feel connected. Now, if love wasn't safe as a child, of course, when you start pulling out those doorstops to loving yourself or blocking love for yourself and allowing that love to come in, it's going to feel vulnerable. It's going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to be taken back to when you were a child and you were faced with love that was maybe abusive or was going to get taken away or was manipulative. And I do think that's why we move towards addictions, because we can actually allow ourselves to feel that connection. I think what these addictive chemicals do is temporarily pull out those doorstops. They allow us to feel love. Like when you're out with your buddies and you're all drunk, it's like, I love you, man. You're the best. I love you. Nobody would say that. No men would say that when they were stone cold sober. It just doesn't happen. So it's really understanding that addiction and anxiety go together hand in hand. I think it's close to 100%. It may not be your classic, alcohol, drugs, cocaine, that kind of addiction, but it can be like sex and love addiction. It can be addiction to exercise. It can be addiction to something that temporarily allows you to be connected to yourself. But when you're in your cold, hard, normal state, those doorstops come back in and they block that love for yourself. And there is this ache, there is this longing for connection. And on some level, benzodiazepines, Ativan, Xanax, opiates, OxyContin, Dilaudid, codeine, pull out those doorstops and allow you to feel that connection to yourself that we all want to feel. But then when the drug wears off, then we're back into the old posterior cingulate, the old, I don't like this about you, this internal dialogue that we, you're too fat, you're too stupid, you're too what? Or you're not enough, you're not this enough, you're not that enough. This stuff starts coming back in and basically jams those doorstops back in. And then we just feel hollow. We feel that we can't, that we're abnormal, that we're weak, that we're somehow dysfunctional or defective. Especially men, there's this feeling of feeling defective. Women too tell me all the time, it's like, this anxiety just makes me feel like I'm less of a person, that I'm defective. And I think it's understanding that it's not coming from outside of you. The feeling of being defective comes from within. And it's a story that got started when you were very young. There's that old saying, like, when you abuse, neglect, or abandon a child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves. And when you stop loving yourselves, your brain looks for reasons why you shouldn't love yourself. So it will start highlighting the negative aspects of your personality. So if you are more, say, self-centered than another person, you will lean into that self-centeredness because it's, on some level, it's a familiar coping strategy. It's like that t-shirt that says, I'm in my own little world, but it's okay. They know me here. We all have negative traits. And we start giving more credibility to those negative traits if we had childhood trauma where we think there's something wrong with us. So if there's something wrong with you, you perceive there's something wrong with you, you will look at your negative traits and give them much more credibility than you will your positive traits. And one of the tenets of your brain is whatever you focus on, you get more of. So if you focus on the fact that you are a selfish person, you will see yourself being selfish and you will give credit to that selfish nature as opposed to seeing the times when you are generous. You probably won't even see the times you're generous because we train our brains to create a certain personality, to create certain defensive adaptations to our environment. Another example is if you were a people pleaser and you had to read your parent when you were younger, like I did, read my mother to make sure she was okay, make her laugh if she's feeling down or anxious, or try to make my father feel connected when he was starting to go bipolar or depressed. So I saw my role as relieving their suffering. So I lost contact with myself. I got very good at helping other people, at reading other people, but more and more lost touch with myself. It's one of the reasons I became a medical doctor. It's one of the reasons I do this. It's one of the reasons I help other people with anxiety. But this is a much more practical, much more self-sustaining way of helping someone than people pleasing. So people pleasing was part of my personality because it was an adaptive strategy to help me stay connected to the people that I needed to stay connected to. But within that connection, I lost myself because I was always trying to give them what they needed. And that became a pattern that ruled my life, which of course was something that I judged myself for. I judge myself for giving too much. You don't give enough to yourself. And that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I didn't give anything to myself and I redoubled my efforts. I took on extra shifts at the hospital. I wrote a book. I did all these things to try and keep helping people as a way of someday hoping that it's going to come back to me. Now, on some level, that is happening. On some level, this is coming back to me. And I am enjoying so much my 60s because I actually can give love and attention and gratitude to myself in a way that I never could when I was younger because of my experiences. So in a way, I became addicted to helping other people. That's one of my addictions. And now I have to be really aware of that it's like I give too much of myself. I get taken advantage of sometimes, but I still do it willingly, but I'm aware of it. So getting back to addictions, I have an addiction to people pleasing. It's something that I'm aware of. It's something that I know that if I actually put my hand on my chest and go, do you really need to help this person right now? Or can you just help yourself? And that has been so helpful for me to actually give myself a choice of not participating in my addiction, bypassing the original trauma, bypassing the original goal, which was to try and get acceptance externally, try and get acceptance outside of me and have that fill me up, which it doesn't. It doesn't. You have to give it to yourself. But that said, you can only take self-love. If you've been judging, abandoning, blaming, shaming yourself for so long, you can only take so much self-love at a time because your ego will revolt. And I talk about that in the book as well, about why it's so hard to heal from anxiety, because it's such a common pathway that you followed for your whole life. Changing that has to be done slowly. And it can be done slowly. And we have to do it that way. So it's understanding your addiction, not shaming yourself for your addiction, understanding that the addiction is there to give you a sense of connection with yourself, because when you're sober, you won't allow that self-connection. You're so steeped in self-criticism and the inner critic that the only way to bypass the inner critic is with an addiction, is with distracting or dissociating or whatever it is from the pain. That's a lot of what addiction is. It's a distraction and dissociation from the pain. Now, if you can learn, and I talk about this in the book as well, how to embrace the pain You cut out the middleman, because when you embrace the pain, you are connecting to yourself at the root cause, at the level that the addiction was created. But again, that has to be done slowly and gradually. Because if you try and do it all of a sudden, I love myself, I love myself, I love myself, your ego is going to go, nope, that's not safe. We're not even going to pay any attention to that, which is a lot of the reason why I think people really dislike these kind of gurus that say, I'll cure your anxiety in 24 hours. It's like, it doesn't work that way. These patterns have been in you for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We're not going to change them overnight. No matter how much hypnosis, which I think is helpful, but no matter what we do, we are not going to change those brain pathways overnight. And we have to do it gradually. And typically, we have to do it initially through the body and creating awareness of how we're separate from ourselves and how the addiction actually allows us to feel connected to ourselves. I often call, codeine and Xanax artificial love, because it allows people to drop their defenses, to drop that self judgment, abandonment, blame, and shame, and feel connected to themselves. That's why we're addicted in the first place. We're addicted because we want to feel this connection to ourselves, but it doesn't last. And when we come off the addiction, we feel even worse, which of course reinforces the addiction, which reinforces the shame, which reinforces the anxiety. So what's the solution? Not an easy solution, but gradually, slowly find a way of connecting with yourself. Read the book, take the MBRX program, find a way of connecting with yourself. Because if you feel connected to yourself and you feel that you are your own best bet, your own best advocate, the addiction tends to fall away. And it also helps you push the addiction away, because now you're aligned with yourself, your authentic self, as opposed to being aligned with the reactive self that needed these things, that needed this chemical to make you feel connected to yourself. When you cut out the middleman and you start being connected to yourself in general, the addictions, and this is what I found myself, tend to lose a lot of their power. And once they lose their power, it's so much easier to get past them. So much easier to get past them. So I think that's going to be it for today. I know I'm rambling a bit, and that's why I do these in one take. I basically just see what comes into my head. I channel it as best as I can, and I send it out to you. And I hope that it makes a difference for you, and that you can see your experience and my experience and not have to suffer with anxiety the way that I did. And I'll see you next time.